Rain lashed against the towering windows of Hartwick Manor with a fury that matched the tempest in Eleanora's heart, each droplet a tiny hammer against the glass, as if nature itself sought to break through the barriers that now enclosed her life. The bedchamber assigned to the new Duchess was vast and cold, decorated in silvers and greys that seemed to leach warmth from the very air, and she stood before the dying fire in her wedding gown ivory silk that had cost her father his last reserves of pride, watching the flames sputter and fail. The ceremony had been brief, perfunctory, witnessed by strangers whose faces blurred together in her memory like watercolors left in rain, and the wedding breakfast had passed in silence, broken only by the scraping of silver against porcelain and the hollow congratulations of people who knew, as she knew, as everyone knew, that this was not a union born of affection but of necessity. Her family's debts had mounted like winter snow, suffocating and inexorable, until her father had come to her with shoulders bent and eyes that could not meet hers. Speaking of arrangements and opportunities and the great fortune of the Duke of Hartwick's interest, though they both understood that interest was far too generous a word for what amounted to a transaction, she had accepted because she loved her father, because her younger sisters deserved their seasons and their chances, because sometimes sacrifice wore a wedding dress and smiled through a loveless ceremony. The door opened without warning, and he entered Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Hartwick, whose reputation preceded him like the chill before a frost, tall and dark-haired, with eyes the color of winter storms, and a face that might have been carved from the same stone as his ancestral home. He did not look at her, not truly, his gaze sliding past her as one might avoid looking directly at the sun, and when he spoke, his voice was low and controlled, each word measured and deliberate. "I trust the chambers are adequate," he said, and she nodded, though adequate seemed a peculiar word for rooms that felt like a gilded cage. He moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back, rigid posture speaking of military discipline, or perhaps simply the habit of holding oneself apart from the world, and for a moment she thought he might say something more, something that would ease the terrible weight of this day. Instead, he turned to face her with an expression of such carefully maintained neutrality that it was worse than anger, worse than disgust, worse than anything she might have prepared herself to endure. "I want you to understand something clearly," he said, and his voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "This marriage is a legal arrangement, nothing more. I shall provide for you, ensure your comfort and status, fulfill every obligation our contract demands. But I will never touch you." The words fell between them like stones into still water, sending ripples of devastation through her chest. And though she had not entered this marriage with romantic illusions and had not expected love or even affection, the deliberate cruelty of his declaration stole the breath from her lungs. He left then, closing the door with a soft click that seemed louder than any slam, and Eleanora stood alone in the grey chamber, still wearing her wedding gown, while the fire died to embers and the rain continued its relentless assault upon the windows, washing away whatever foolish hope she had not known she carried until it was gone. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. The memory of how she had arrived at this moment returned to Eleanora as she finally removed her wedding gown with trembling fingers, the silk whispering against her skin like secrets she could never share, and she found herself transported back 3 months to her father's study, where afternoon light had filtered through dusty windows onto ledgers that told the story of their ruin in neat columns of figures that no longer balanced. Her father, Lord Edmund Ashworth, had aged a decade in the span of a year, his hair gone entirely grey and his hands shaking as he explained that the investments had failed, that the creditors were circling like vultures, that her sister's futures hung in the balance unless something could be done. And when he spoke the Duke of Hartwick's name, it was with the tone of a man grasping at the last branch before the fall. Sebastian Ashford's reputation had preceded the marriage negotiations, like the scent of winter before the first snow. He was known throughout society as a man of impeccable lineage and vast wealth, yet also as someone who moved through ballrooms like a spectre, dancing only when protocol demanded, speaking only when necessary, and his emotional landscape as barren and forbidding as the northern moors that comprised part of his holdings. The solicitors had arrived with documents already prepared, as if her acceptance had been assumed, and she supposed it had been. For what choice did a gentlewoman possess when her family faced destitution and her sisters faced the workhouse or worse? The Duke himself had appeared only once during the negotiations, striding into her father's study with the bearing of a man who had never been denied anything, his eyes sweeping over her with the same assessment one might give a horse at auction. And when he spoke, asking if she understood the terms and could fulfill the duties expected of a duchess, his voice had been devoid of warmth, but also devoid of cruelty, merely transactional, as if they were discussing the purchase of land rather than the joining of lives. She had signed where indicated, her signature binding her as surely as any chain, and her father had wept with relief while she had felt something inside herself go numb, a protective frost settling over her heart. The settlement had been generous by any measure her father's debts cleared, a substantial dowry provided for each of her sisters, a townhouse in London secured for her mother, and all it cost was Eleanora herself and her future, her hope of ever knowing the kind of love she had read about in poems and novels. Now, standing in her nightdress in the cold chamber of Hartwick Manor, she understood that the transaction was complete, the contract executed, and she was utterly, irrevocably alone despite the ring upon her finger, and the title before her name, the Duchess of Hartwick, in name only, a ghost haunting rooms that would never truly be hers, bound to a man who had made it abundantly clear that she would remain forever untouched, unwanted, a piece of furniture acquired to fulfill an obligation, and then forgotten in the vast, echoing emptiness of his ancestral home. Weeks passed in a rhythm of careful avoidance, each day bleeding into the next with the monotonous predictability of a clock counting down hours in an empty room, and Eleanora learned the geography of her new existence through the careful mapping of when and where the Duke would not be, her life becoming a choreographed dance of separation within the sprawling confines of Hartwick Manor. Dinners were formal affairs conducted in the cavernous dining hall, where they sat at opposite ends of a table designed to seat 30, and the distance between them, a physical manifestation of the chasm he had decreed on their wedding night, and they ate in silence, punctuated only by the soft footfalls of servants and the precise click of silver against porcelain, each meal a performance of civility that left her hollow and aching. The Duke maintained a schedule of such rigid exactitude that she could set her own movements. By his absence, he took breakfast at precisely 7 in his private study, rode out to inspect the estate at 9, conducted business with his steward from 11 until 1, lunched alone in the library, and spent his afternoons in pursuits that took him far from whatever rooms she might occupy, as if her very presence carried a contagion he feared to contract. She found solace, if such a word could be applied to her lonely wanderings, in the Manor's extensive library, a vast collection spanning 3 floors of the East Wing, where thousands of leather-bound volumes stood like silent sentinels, guarding the accumulated knowledge of generations, and here, among the philosophers and poets, the historians and novelists, she could lose herself in worlds where women were loved and valued, where marriages were partnerships rather than prisons, where touch was not a forbidden territory but a language of connection. The servants, those invisible witnesses to the strange tableau of the Hartwick marriage, spoke in whispers she was not meant to overhear, but which reached her nonetheless through the peculiar acoustics of the Manor's ancient hallways. They wondered at a duke who kept his young bride at such remove, who showed her every courtesy except the fundamental one of companionship, who treated her with the distant politeness one might extend to a visiting dignitary, rather than the woman who bore his name and would theoretically bear his heirs, though how such an eventuality might occur, given his vow, remained a mystery that set tongues wagging in the kitchens and servants' quarters. Mrs. Daventry, the housekeeper, regarded Eleanora with a sympathy that was almost worse than indifference, her eyes reflecting a pity that suggested she had seen this pattern before, that the current Duke was merely following in footsteps laid down by ancestors who had similarly kept their wives at arm's length, treating marriage as a duty to be endured, rather than a joy to be embraced, and Eleanora wondered if she would spend the next 40 years wandering these halls like the ghosts that surely must haunt such an old and sorrowful place, a living spectre, dressed in fine gowns and draped in jewels that could not compensate for the fundamental poverty of human connection. It was during one of her aimless wanderings through the Manor's lesser-used corridors that Eleanora first glimpsed something unexpected in her husband's character, a crack in the marble facade that suggested depths she had not imagined possible in a man who seemed constructed entirely of ice and protocol. And it came in the form of a garden she discovered, quite by accident, when she took a wrong turn seeking the conservatory and instead found herself before tall windows overlooking a walled enclosure where roses bloomed in defiant profusion, despite the approaching autumn chill. The garden was immaculately maintained, each bush pruned with an artist's precision, the paths between them swept clean of even a single fallen petal, and as she stood transfixed by the unexpected beauty of this hidden sanctuary, she saw him, the Duke himself, coatless and with sleeves rolled to his elbows in a state of casual undress she had never witnessed, kneeling beside a particularly magnificent white rose bush with secateurs in hand, his movements, as he trimmed away dead wood, possessing a gentleness that seemed utterly at odds with the man who could not bear to sit within 20 feet of her at dinner. She watched from her concealed vantage point as he worked, noting the way his shoulders gradually relaxed as he moved from plant to plant, how his normally severe expression softened into something approaching peace, and she realized, with a sudden clarity, that this garden was not merely a hobby, but a sanctuary, a place where whatever demons drove him to maintain such rigid control over every aspect of his existence were temporarily held at bay by the simple act of tending living things that required his care. Over the following days, she found herself drawn back to those windows at the times she had observed him visiting the garden, studying him as one might study a rare and fascinating specimen, seeking to understand the contradiction of a man who could nurture roses with such devotion, yet could not extend the smallest gesture of warmth to the woman who bore his name. And it was during one of these observations that she noticed the marble statue at the garden's center, a woman captured in stone, her face serene and lovely, surrounded by the same white roses the Duke tended with such particular attention. Curiosity drove her to make inquiries of Mrs. Daventry, who revealed with careful words that the garden had been the late Duchess's private retreat, that the Duke's mother had designed it herself in the last years of her life, and that her son had maintained it with unwavering dedication since her death 15 years prior, never allowing anyone else to touch so much as a single stem. And when Eleanora asked when the Duchess had died, the housekeeper's answer struck her like a physical blow. The anniversary fell in just 3 weeks, and the entire household knew to tread carefully during that time. For the Duke's already formidable reserve became absolute, his grief manifesting as an even colder withdrawal from the world of the living. Understanding bloomed in Eleanora's mind like one of those carefully tended roses. His coldness was not cruelty but armor, his distance not disdain but self-protection, and she found herself wondering what sorrows lay buried beneath that impenetrable exterior. What losses had taught him that to love was to invite devastation, and whether there existed any key that might unlock the fortress he had built around his wounded heart. Insomnia had become Eleanora's unwelcome companion in the weeks since her arrival at Hartwick Manor, sleep proving elusive in the too large bed within her 2 empty chambers, and so it was that she found herself descending the shadowed staircase well past midnight, drawn by the promise of distraction that only books could provide, her dressing gown wrapped tight against the autumn chill that permeated even the grandest rooms of this ancient estate, a candle held before her to illuminate the familiar path to the library, where she had spent so many solitary hours seeking refuge from the peculiar loneliness of her married state. She pushed open the heavy oak door with practiced silence, expecting to find the vast room empty as it always was at this late hour, but instead she froze at the threshold, her breath catching in her throat as she registered the figure standing before the philosophy section, his dark silhouette illuminated by the single lamp he had lit, and for a moment she considered retreating before he noticed her presence. But some stubborn pride, or perhaps simple exhaustion, kept her rooted to the spot as the Duke turned, his expression shifting from surprise to something she could not quite name, as his eyes met hers across the leather-scented expanse. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, and he inclined his head in that formal manner that characterized every interaction between them, his posture rigid despite the lateness of the hour and the intimacy suggested by their nightclothes and the darkness surrounding them, like a cocoon separating this moment from the harsh light of day, where such proximity would be carefully avoided. "Duchess," he replied, and she noticed he held a volume in his hands, its spine too shadowed for her to make out the title. and they stood thus for several heartbeats, neither willing to be the first to break the strange spell of this unexpected encounter, until finally she moved further into the room. Refusing to be driven from the one place in this manner that felt like sanctuary, even if it meant sharing the space with the man who had decreed she remain forever untouched. She selected a book at random from a nearby shelf, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it, and from the corner of her eye she saw him watching her, and then his voice cut through the silence with words that surprised her with their genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness. "Spinoza, I would not have imagined you interested in metaphysics and ethics." The presumption in his tone sparked something rebellious in her chest, and she met his gaze directly for perhaps the first time since their wedding night, her chin lifting as she responded, "You would not have imagined it because you have never inquired into my interests, my lord. But yes, I find questions of determinism and freedom particularly compelling given certain circumstances," and she did not need to elaborate on what circumstances she meant, the barb landing with enough precision that she saw something flicker in his eyes, surprise. Certainly, and perhaps the smallest glimmer of what might have been respect. He opened his mouth as if to respond, seemed to reconsider, and then simply nodded, turning back to his own book. But Eleanora found herself unable to concentrate on the dense philosophical prose before her, too aware of his presence mere feet away, too conscious of the fact that this was the longest exchange they had shared since their marriage, and when she finally glanced up again, he was gone, having retreated as silently as a ghost, leaving only the faint scent of his sandalwood cologne and the dangerous stirring of something that felt dangerously like hope taking root in the barren landscape of her heart. Autumn arrived at Hartwick Manor with its characteristic melancholy, painting the grounds in shades of amber and crimson that seemed to mirror the complex emotions stirring within Eleanora's breast, and as the days grew shorter and the evenings longer, she found that her encounters with the Duke in the library had evolved from rare accidents into something approaching a pattern, their midnight meetings occurring with increasing frequency, as though some unspoken agreement had formed between them that this twilight hour belonged to neither day nor duty, but existed in a space apart, where the rigid rules governing their daylight interactions might be cautiously relaxed. Their conversations had lengthened incrementally, expanding from terse exchanges about specific volumes to discussions that ranged across literature and philosophy, history and poetry, and Eleanora discovered beneath his forbidding exterior a mind of remarkable depth and surprising sensitivity, finding herself engaged in debates about Rousseau's social contract and disagreements over Byron's merit, as a poet that lasted well past the point where her candle had burned low and the first hints of dawn threatened at the windows. She noticed, too, the subtle shifts in his demeanor during these encounters, the way his shoulders no longer held quite the same rigid tension when he spoke with her, how his responses came more readily and with less of the careful deliberation that characterized his every word in other settings, and once, when she had made an observation about Milton's Paradise Lost that clearly struck him as particularly insightful, she could have sworn she saw the ghost of a smile touch the corners of his mouth before his habitual reserve reasserted itself and the moment passed like morning mist beneath the sun's first rays. Yet even as these small intimacies accumulated like autumn leaves upon the ground, Eleanora found her loneliness deepening rather than diminishing, for there remained between them an invisible but insurmountable barrier that he would not cross, his physical distance from her as carefully maintained as ever, despite the growing ease of their intellectual communion, and she began to understand that this was in some ways more cruel than his initial complete avoidance, for now she knew the man behind the cold facade, and found herself yearning not just for companionship, but for the warmth of genuine connection that seemed to hover perpetually just beyond her reach. The Duke, for his part, seemed equally caught in this strange liminal space, and she sometimes caught him watching her during their dinners with an expression she could not quite decipher, something that might have been longing or regret or perhaps both intermingled, and once when she had reached for a book on a high shelf at the same moment he did, their hands had nearly touched before he withdrew as though burned, and she had seen something flash in his eyes that looked remarkably like anguish before he turned away, leaving her standing alone among the leather-bound volumes with her heart pounding and her hand still outstretched toward the space where his had been, wondering how long they could continue this delicate dance of approach and retreat before something gave way beneath the accumulated weight of all these unuttered feelings that hung between them like the autumn fog that shrouded the manor grounds each morning, obscuring the path forward and leaving them both suspended in beautiful, terrible uncertainty. The discovery came quite by accident one October afternoon when the Duke had returned early from surveying the tenant farms, his boots muddy from the rain-softened earth, and his mind preoccupied with matters of drainage and crop rotation, and he had sought the peace of his mother's garden, as he often did when the weight of his responsibilities pressed too heavily upon him, only to find he was not alone among the rose bushes that had been her particular pride, and which he tended with meticulous devotion, each season as a kind of living memorial to the woman who had been the sole source of warmth in his otherwise cold childhood. There, kneeling in the damp soil with her skirts spread around her like the petals of some exotic flower, was Eleanora, her hands bare and dirt-stained as she carefully pruned away the dead blooms and tucked fresh mulch around the roots of the late-season roses, her movements so gentle and reverent that he found himself frozen at the garden gate, unable to speak or move. As he watched this woman, he had vowed to keep at arm's length, tending the most sacred space of his private grief with such obvious care that something painful and warm simultaneously twisted in his chest. She must have sensed his presence, for she looked up suddenly, her eyes widening with what might have been guilt or fear, and she began to rise, stammering an apology. "Your Grace, forgive me. I know I should have asked permission, but I noticed the garden seemed neglected of late, and I thought perhaps—" But he raised a hand to still her words, surprising them both with the gentleness of the gesture, and he heard himself say in a voice rougher than he intended, "My mother planted these roses the year I was born, the white ones for purity and the red for passion, though she had precious little of either in her marriage to my father." Eleanora settled back onto her heels, her hands still clutching the pruning shears, and she spoke softly. "I lost my mother when I was 12 years old, and I remember how she loved her garden, how she said that tending living things was the closest we could come to understanding the divine work of creation. And when I found this place, so clearly loved and yet showing signs of recent neglect, I felt I understood something of your loss." And the Duke found himself moving forward without conscious decision, kneeling beside her in the damp earth with complete disregard for his fine clothes, reaching out to touch one of the crimson blooms his mother had called the Duchess of Portland roses. They remained thus for a long moment, side by side among the flowers, and then he began to speak of things he had never told, another living soul of his mother's gentle wisdom and terrible loneliness, of how she had withered in his father's house like a rose deprived of sunlight, of how he had held her hand as she died, and vowed never to trap another woman in such a cage of coldness and duty, never to become the kind of husband his father had been. And it was only as the words poured from him that he realized the terrible irony of his vow, how in trying to protect Eleanora from his father's legacy, he had instead recreated it in a different form. When he finally fell silent, Eleanora reached out and placed her dirt-stained hand over his where it rested on his knee, the first deliberate touch they had shared since their wedding night, and she said with quiet conviction, "You are not your father, Sebastian," using his given name for the first time. "A man like your father would never tend these roses with such devotion, would never carry such grief for a woman's suffering, would never speak of these things with such raw honesty." And when he looked at her then, really looked at her with the afternoon sun, turning her hair to spun gold and her eyes dark with compassion and something deeper he dared not name, he felt the corner of his mouth lift in what was almost nearly achingly close to a smile, and Eleanora's breath caught as she witnessed this transformation, feeling her heart stumble and race as the terrible, beautiful truth crystallized within her consciousness. She had fallen in love with her husband, this wounded, careful man who hid an ocean of feeling beneath his frozen exterior, and the realization filled her simultaneously with joy and despair. For what future could there be in loving a man who had vowed never to touch her, who kept her at such careful distance, even as their souls drew inexorably closer with each passing day? Winter descended upon Hartwick Manor with unexpected ferocity that year, arriving early in November with blizzards that transformed the familiar landscape into an alien realm of white silence, and the practical necessities of survival in such conditions paradoxically drew the Duke and Duchess into closer physical proximity than they had yet experienced. for the ancient manor's heating system proved inadequate to warm the vast empty spaces, necessitating that they abandon the fiction of separate wings and share the more intimate rooms where fires could be efficiently maintained. The smaller drawing room, the morning room, and inevitably the library where they had first begun their careful dance of intellectual courtship. Eleanora found herself spending long evenings in Sebastian's presence, the two of them seated in wing-backed chairs drawn near the hearth, ostensibly reading, but often falling into conversations that grew increasingly personal as the winter nights stretched endlessly, and the isolation from the outside world created a kind of sanctuary where the normal rules seemed temporarily suspended. And it was during these firelit hours that he began, haltingly at first and then with increasing openness, to reveal the fragments of his past that had shaped him into the man he had become. He spoke of his father, the late Duke, whose cruelty had been legendary among the servants, though carefully hidden from society. A man who had viewed affection as weakness and tenderness as contemptible, who had beaten his son for crying and mocked his wife's gentle nature until she retreated into silence and eventually into death. And Sebastian's voice remained steady as he recounted these horrors, but Eleanora could see the tension in his jaw, the whiteness of his knuckles as he gripped the arms of his chair, and she understood that he was offering her something precious and terrible, the truth of his wounds and the reasons for his carefully constructed walls. "I watched him destroy her," Sebastian said one evening, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "My mother was like spring itself when she first came here, full of light and hope and music, and he systematically extinguished all of it, criticized every joy until she learned to show none, mocked every kindness until she ceased to offer any. And I was 10 years old when I found her weeping in the conservatory, and she told me that love was the most dangerous thing a woman could feel because it gave men the power to break her utterly. And I vowed then that I would never be such a man, that if I ever married I would never wield such power, never allow myself to become close enough to wound so deeply." Eleanora felt her heart constrict with understanding and anguish, for she finally comprehended the terrible logic of his wedding night. Vow he had thought himself merciful, had believed that distance was protection, that coldness was kindness compared to the alternative he had witnessed, and she realized with crystalline clarity that he did not fear her, but rather feared himself, feared the monster he believed lurked within him by virtue of his blood and upbringing, and this understanding brought her no comfort, but rather deepened her love and simultaneously sharpened her pain. For how could she reach a man so determined to protect her from himself, and how could she continue to live in this liminal space where their souls drew ever closer, while their bodies remained separated by his iron-clad resolve? And as she watched the firelight play across his austere features, she felt the first whisper of an impossible thought, that perhaps the kindest thing she could do for both of them would be to leave, to free him from the torture of proximity to a wife he would not allow himself to truly have, and to free herself from the exquisite agony of loving a man who had locked himself away behind walls she could see but never breach. The crystallization of truth came to Eleanora on a December evening when the snow fell thick and silent beyond the library windows, muffling the world in white stillness, and she sat in her customary chair watching Sebastian across the hearth as he read from a volume of poetry, his deep voice rendering the verses with unexpected tenderness, and she felt her heart simultaneously expand with love and contract with unbearable pain, as she understood with complete and devastating clarity that she had fallen irrevocably in love with this wounded, careful man who kept her at such precise distance, even as their souls entwined ever more tightly with each passing day. And the recognition brought no joy, but rather a crushing weight of impossibility, for what future existed in loving a husband who would share his deepest fears and fondest memories, yet would not permit himself the simple human comfort of a touch, who would speak with her for hours in the firelight, yet would retreat to separate chambers each night with the rigid discipline of a monk observing holy vows. And she realized, with the sharp clarity of desperation, that she could not continue to exist in this liminal space between intimacy and isolation. He could not endure the exquisite torture of being so close to him in spirit, while remaining forever separated in flesh. He could not spend the rest of her life loving a man who would never allow himself to love her in return, no matter how much she suspected he might wish to do so beneath his fortress of control and fear. She watched him turn a page, his long fingers careful with the delicate paper, and she thought how those same hands had never once reached for hers, except in the most formal of circumstances, how he maintained always a precise distance between them, even when they sat as they did now in apparent companionship. And she felt something break within her chest, some final reserve of patience or hope or endurance, and she knew with sudden certainty that she must leave this place, must free herself from this beautiful agony before it destroyed her utterly, and paradoxically she must also free him, for she could see how her presence tormented him, how he struggled daily against his own desires and fears, how he denied himself the warmth he so clearly craved because he believed himself unworthy or dangerous or both, and perhaps the greatest kindness she could offer this man she loved would be to remove herself from his reach, to release him from the burden of her presence and the temptation of her proximity. The decision settled over her like the snow settling beyond the windows, cold and quiet and absolute, and she felt a strange calm descend as the impossible became simply necessary, and when Sebastian looked up from his book and asked with rare gentleness if she was well, for he had learned to read the subtle shifts in her expression during these months of careful observation, she managed to smile and lie with a steady voice, "Yes, merely tired. I think I shall retire early tonight." And she rose and bid him good night with all the composure she could muster, and as she climbed the stairs to her chambers, she knew that she would spend this night writing the letter that would end their strange marriage of minds while their bodies remained forever strangers, and that by dawn she would be gone from Hartwick Manor, carrying with her a love that could never be consummated and a grief that would never fully heal, but carrying also the knowledge that sometimes the most loving act is to walk away from the person who cannot bring themselves to reach for you, no matter how desperately both of you might wish they could. The manor slept in winter silence as Eleanora sat at her writing desk in the small hours before dawn, a single candle flickering beside her trembling hand, casting dancing shadows across the blank page that seemed to mock her with its emptiness, for how could she possibly find words adequate to express the impossible tangle of love and grief and understanding that filled her heart to breaking? Yet she knew she must try, must leave him some explanation for her departure, lest he think himself abandoned without cause, or believe her departure a rejection, when it was in truth the opposite, an act of mercy born from the deepest love she had ever known, and so she dipped her pen in ink and began to write, the words flowing like tears onto the paper as she poured out everything she had kept locked within her careful composure during these long months of proximity and distance. "My dearest Sebastian," she wrote, and even seeing his name in her own hand made her throat constrict with sorrow. "I am writing these words in the deep night while you sleep in your separate chambers, and by the time you read them I shall be gone from Hartwick Manor, returning to my family's countryside home, and I know this will seem a cowardly departure, a flight in darkness, but I beg you to understand that I leave not from lack of courage, but rather because I have finally found the courage to acknowledge a truth that has become unbearable. I love you, Sebastian. I love you with a completeness that terrifies me, and I can no longer remain in this beautiful torture of a marriage where our souls grow ever closer while our bodies remain eternally separated by walls of your own construction." Her hand shook as she continued, ink blotting slightly on the page, but she pressed onward, needing him to understand. "I know why you made your vow on our wedding night. I understand now the terrible logic of your distance, for you have shared with me the horrors of your childhood and the wounds your father inflicted upon your mother, and I comprehend that you fear yourself. Fear the capacity for cruelty you believe lies dormant in your blood. But Sebastian, my darling, you are not your father, you could never be him, for your very fear of becoming him proves how different you are, how gentle your soul despite the harshness of your upbringing, and the distance you maintain is not protection, but rather a different kind of prison, one that confines us both in separate cells of loneliness, even as we yearn toward each other through the bars." She paused, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, leaving a small smudge of ink, then continued writing the hardest words of all. "I cannot ask you to change, cannot demand that you break the vows you made to yourself in the name of honor and protection, but neither can I continue to exist in this liminal space where I am wife in name but stranger in truth, where I love you more each day while knowing that love will never be returned in the fullness I crave, not because you do not feel it, for I believe you do. Sebastian, I see it in your eyes when you think I am not watching, in the careful way you speak my name, in the longing that crosses your face before you master it, but because you will not permit yourself to feel it. And I understand your reasons, but I cannot bear the cost, cannot spend my life loving a man who will never allow himself to love me in return. She signed the letter simply, "Yours always, Eleanora," placed it carefully on her writing desk where he would find it, and began her final preparations to leave at first light, her heart breaking even as she recognized the necessity of this terrible kindness to them both. Sebastian woke before dawn from restless dreams, filled with shadows and unspoken words, his sleep having been fractured and troubled throughout the night by an inexplicable sense of wrongness that had permeated even his unconscious mind. And he rose in the grey pre-morning light with an unfamiliar urgency thrumming through his veins, something drawing him from his chambers, though he could not name what compelled him, and he found himself walking through the silent corridors of the sleeping manor toward Eleanora's wing, though he had no conscious intention of doing so, his feet carrying him as though pulled by invisible threads, and when he reached her door he hesitated only a moment before entering propriety. Be damned. Something whispered that this was necessary, and the emptiness of her chambers struck him immediately, the bed neatly made as though never slept in, the wardrobe doors standing open to reveal absent gowns, and panic began to rise in his chest like ice water, flooding his lungs as he turned, and saw the letter on her writing desk, the creamy paper catching the weak morning light, his name written across it in her elegant hand, and with trembling fingers he lifted it and began to read, each word striking him like a physical blow, as the truth of what he had done, what he had failed to do, crashed over him in waves of devastating comprehension. "I love you, Sebastian." The words blurred before his eyes as he read them again and again. "I love you with a completeness that terrifies me." And he felt something crack open in his chest, some fortress he had built so carefully around his heart, shattering like glass, for he had known on some level that she cared for him, had seen the softness in her eyes during their library conversations, but to see it written so plainly, so courageously, to understand that she loved him enough to leave rather than continue in the agony of their half-marriage, it broke something fundamental in his carefully constructed defenses, and as he continued reading, "You are not your father. You could never be him." He felt tears he had not shed since childhood burning behind his eyes, for she saw him, truly saw him, understood both his fears and their falseness, loved him despite and because of everything he was, and he had been too much a coward to reach for the gift she offered, that had hidden behind duty and distance and the ghost of his father's cruelty, when all along what he feared most was not hurting her, but rather allowing himself to need her, to love her, and to become vulnerable in the way that love demanded. He crushed the letter against his chest as realization flooded through him with the force of revelation. He loved her. God help him, he loved Eleanora, with a fierceness that terrified him precisely because it was everything he had sworn never to feel, and she was leaving, had perhaps already left, and he could not, would not let her go. Not now, when he finally understood what a fool he had been, and he ran from her chambers shouting for his valet, for his horse to be saddled immediately, racing through the manor with wild, desperate energy as servants scattered before him in alarm. And when he reached the front entrance and burst into the winter morning, he saw with sinking heart the fresh tracks in the snow where her carriage had departed, the trail leading away from Hartwick Manor toward the road that would carry her forever from his life unless he could catch her, unless he could find the courage to tell her what her letter had finally forced him to acknowledge, that he loved her, that he had always loved her, that he had been dying slowly in the prison of his own making, and only her leaving had shown him that some risks were worth taking, some walls worth demolishing, some vows worth breaking for the sake of a greater promise, and he mounted his horse and rode after her into the grey dawn, with his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged bird, finally understanding that the door had always been unlocked, and that freedom and love had always been within reach, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not maintaining distance, but rather closing it, not building walls but tearing them down, not protecting yourself from pain, but opening yourself to the possibility of joy, even when every instinct screams to retreat into familiar solitude. The winter morning erupted into chaos as Sebastian rode like a man possessed through the iron gates of Hartwick Manor, his horse's hooves throwing up sprays of snow as they thundered down the long drive toward the main road. and the sky above had transformed from grey dawn to something darker and more ominous, heavy clouds gathering with unnatural swiftness, as though nature itself conspired to mirror the tempest raging in his chest. And he urged his mount, faster, faster, following the carriage tracks that cut through fresh snow like accusations of his own blindness, his own cowardice, and with each pounding hoofbeat, he felt the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart crumbling further, felt the truth of Eleanora's words burning through him like fire, "You are not your father." And he realized with stunning clarity that his entire philosophy of distance had been founded on a lie, that he had been so afraid of becoming a monster that he had instead become a ghost, haunting his own life without truly living it, denying himself and the woman he loved the very happiness he claimed he was protecting, and the absurdity of it struck him with the force of revelation, even as the first drops of freezing rain began to fall, turning the snow beneath his horse's hooves slick and treacherous. He had been riding for perhaps 20 minutes when he crested a hill and saw it Eleanora's carriage moving slowly along the winding road below, a dark shape against the white landscape, and his heart leaped with desperate relief even as the storm intensified around him, rain now falling in earnest sheets that obscured vision and made the road ahead dangerous. But he did not slow, could not slow, not when she was so close, not when everything he had ever wanted without daring to acknowledge it was pulling away from him in that carriage. And he drove his horse onward down the treacherous slope, in his internal monologue, a running litany of self-recrimination and newfound understanding. I love her. I have always loved her. From that first night, when she stood before me with such dignity despite my cruelty, through every library conversation and garden encounter, I have been falling and falling and calling it duty, calling it protection, calling it anything but what it was. And she knew, God help me, she knew and loved me anyway, loved me enough to set me free, even when it meant losing everything she had sacrificed for. The rain lashed at his face as he closed the distance, thunder rumbling overhead in perfect synchronization with the pounding of his heart. And he saw the carriage driver pull back on the reins as the road grew more treacherous, saw the vehicle slow and then stop entirely at a particularly dangerous curve where the cliff dropped away sharply to one side, and Sebastian drew alongside with wild, desperate energy, calling out, "Stop, stop," though the driver had already halted, and he flung himself from his horse even before it had fully stopped, slipping slightly in the mud and rain but catching himself, and he strode toward the carriage door with purpose born of absolute certainty, knowing that what happened in the next moments would determine the course of his entire life. That he stood at a crossroads between the cold, familiar prison of his self-imposed isolation and the terrifying, beautiful unknown of genuine connection. And for the first time since his mother's death, he chose risk over safety, chose vulnerability over protection, chose love over fear, and he reached for the carriage door with hands that trembled not from cold, but from the magnitude of what he was about to do. Sebastian wrenched open the carriage door with such force that it swung wide on its hinges. And there she sat, Eleanora, his wife, his Duchess, the woman he had been too blind and frightened to truly see, her eyes widening in shock as rain swept into the interior of the carriage, her traveling cloak pulled tight around her shoulders and her face pale with surprise and something else, something that might have been hope or fear or both intermingled, and without thinking, without planning, operating purely on instinct and desperate need, he reached for her hand and pulled her from the carriage into the storm, into the rain that fell in torrents around them, soaking them both within seconds as she gasped at the cold and the suddenness of it all, and he held her there in the middle of the muddy road, with the wind whipping around them and thunder rolling overhead, held her wrist gently but firmly, as though afraid she might dissolve like morning mist if he loosened his grip. And when she tried to speak, "Sebastian, what are you?" He shook his head violently, the water streaming from his hair down his face, and the words came pouring out of him in a rush that he could not have stopped if he tried, all the dammed-up emotion of months and years breaking free in a flood. "I was a coward," he said, his voice raw and breaking, loud enough to be heard over the storm. "I was a coward who thought distance would protect us both, who believed that if I never touched you, never allowed myself to feel what I felt, I could somehow escape becoming the monster my father was. But Eleanora, God, Eleanora, I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong." And he saw tears beginning to track down her cheeks, mixing with the rain until it was impossible to distinguish one from the other, her lips parting as though to respond, but he pressed on, needing to say everything before courage failed him, before the familiar walls could rebuild themselves. I love you with everything I am. I have loved you since you first walked into my library and challenged me with your intelligence, since I found you tending my mother's roses with such care, since every conversation that left me wanting more, wanting you, and I told myself it was duty, told myself I was protecting you from a legacy of violence and cruelty. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from the terrifying vulnerability of needing someone, of loving someone so completely that their absence would destroy me. And now she was openly crying, her whole body trembling as she stood before him in the pouring rain, and he released her wrist only to cup her face in both his hands, thumbs brushing away, tears that were immediately replaced by rain and more tears. I read your letter, he continued, his own voice thick with emotion, every word of it, and it shattered me, Eleanora, shattered every defense I had constructed, because you saw me, you truly saw me, and you loved me anyway, loved me enough to leave rather than continue in the half-life I had condemned us both to, and I will not let you go, not now that I finally understand that the greatest risk is not in loving, but in refusing to love, not in touching, but in maintaining this terrible distance. And he leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers, their breath mingling in the cold air between them. I am asking you to come home, to give me another chance, to teach me how to be the husband you deserve, rather than the ghost I have been. And I know I have no right to ask this after the pain I have caused you. But Eleanora, my darling Eleanora, please. And she silenced him by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his in a kiss that tasted of salt and rain and forgiveness. A kiss that broke every vow he had made on their wedding night and sealed a new promise in its place. And he pulled her close, truly close for the first time in their marriage, feeling her body against his through their soaked clothing, feeling her arms wrap around his neck as his encircled her waist. And in that moment, on a muddy road in a winter storm, the physical barrier that had defined their marriage finally, irrevocably shattered. They stood locked together in the storm for what felt like an eternity, and yet no time at all, the rain continuing to pour around them, as Sebastian held Eleanora as though she were the only solid thing in a world gone liquid and uncertain. And when they finally pulled back enough to look at each other, both breathing hard and trembling from cold and emotion, he saw in her eyes something he had never dared to hope for, complete acceptance, complete forgiveness, complete love offered freely, despite everything he had done to push her away. And he felt his throat tighten with the weight of it, with the magnitude of this gift she was giving him, this second chance he had done nothing to deserve. And he opened his mouth to speak, but found himself at a loss. All the eloquent words that had always come so easily to him in books and formal settings, now deserting him entirely, leaving him vulnerable and exposed in a way that terrified and exhilarated him simultaneously. Teach me, he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper despite the storm, his hands still framing her face as though he could memorize the feel of her through touch alone. Teach me how to be a husband to you, Eleanora, because God knows I have no idea how to do this, how to love someone without destroying them or myself in the process, how to touch without taking, how to need without consuming. And I am so afraid. But she pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him gently, and when she spoke, her voice was steady despite her tears, filled with a quiet strength that humbled him utterly. You already know how, Sebastian, she said, and there was such tenderness in her tone that he felt something crack open inside his chest, some final barrier giving way. You have shown me in 1,000 small ways, even as you denied us, both in the way you tend your mother's garden with such reverence, in the gentleness of your hands with frightened horses, in the fairness you show your tenants, even when it costs you profit, and in every conversation where you listen to me as though my thoughts mattered as much as your own. You are not the monster you fear becoming. You never were, and I promise you that together we will build something different, something neither of us has known before, something wholly ours. And he gathered her close again, burying his face in her rain-soaked hair, breathing in the scent of her beneath the smell of wet wool and winter air, and he felt the last of his carefully constructed defenses crumble into nothing. felt himself becoming something new in her arms, something raw and unfinished, but genuine, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion, but certain. "Come home with me. Come home and let me spend the rest of my life proving that you were right to give me this chance. Let me learn to be worthy of the love you offer so freely." And she nodded against his chest, her own arms tightening around him, and together they turned toward the carriage and his waiting horse, the storm beginning to ease around them as though it too recognized that its purpose had been served, that the tempest needed for this transformation had run its course. And as they rode back toward Hartwick Manor together, Eleanora in the carriage and Sebastian riding alongside, their hands reaching out to touch whenever the path allowed it, both of them knew that they were returning to a house that would no longer be a prison of polite distance and careful avoidance, but rather the foundation upon which they would build an entirely new life, one rooted not in fear and protection, but in the terrifying, beautiful courage of choosing vulnerability, of choosing each other, of choosing love. They returned to Hartwick Manor as the storm finally broke into silence, the clouds parting to reveal a winter sky washed clean and scattered with stars. And as they crossed the threshold together, Sebastian's hand firm and warm around Eleanora's, no longer hesitant or careful, but certain, and claiming the servants who had gathered in anxious confusion at the Duke's sudden departure, took one look at their master and mistress, at the way they stood close with fingers intertwined and eyes only for each other, and understanding rippled through the household like wind through wheat, bringing with it a collective exhale of relief and barely suppressed joy that the strange cold marriage had finally, miraculously, transformed into something real. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper who had served the family for 30 years and had watched Sebastian grow from grieving boy to frozen man, felt tears prick her eyes as the Duke turned to her and asked in a voice rough with emotion for a bath to be drawn in the Duchess's chambers and a fire built high, and when Eleanora's maid curtsied and moved to follow them upstairs, Sebastian shook his head gently and said, "Not tonight. We shall require no assistance this evening." And the meaning was clear enough that the girl blushed and retreated, leaving the Duke and Duchess to climb the grand staircase alone, their wet clothes leaving a trail of water on the polished wood, neither of them caring in the slightest. The door to Eleanora's chambers closed behind them with a soft click, and in the firelight that already danced across the walls, Sebastian turned to his wife and saw her watching him with an expression that held both love and nervousness, and he understood because he felt it too, this sense of standing on the precipice of something sacred and irrevocable, and he approached her slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw if she wished, but she remained still, her breath quickening as he reached for the fastenings of her soaked traveling cloak, his fingers trembling slightly as he worked them free, and when the heavy wool fell away, she reached for him in turn, helping him shrug out of his own wet coat, and what followed was a careful, tender exploration, a gradual discovery of each other conducted with such reverence and patience that it felt less like a claiming and more like a conversation, a dialogue spoken in touches and sighs and whispered endearments, and when they finally came together fully, truly, as husband and wife in every sense, it was with a gentleness that belied the passion underneath. Sebastian true to his word as he let Eleanora guide him, as he learned the geography of her body and the sounds of her pleasure, as he whispered against her skin that he loved her, would love her until his dying breath and beyond. Morning found them tangled together in sheets that had become twisted during the night, dawn light streaming through the windows to paint everything gold, and Eleanora woke first to find Sebastian watching her with an expression of such wonder and contentment that she felt her heart might burst from the fullness of it, and when she reached up to trace the line of his jaw, he caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, then to her wrist, then to the inside of her elbow, mapping her with his lips as though committing her to permanent memory, and she laughed, a sound of pure joy that made him smile, in return a real smile, unguarded and luminous, and she realized she had never heard him laugh. Not truly, but now as she pulled him close again he did, a low rumble of happiness that vibrated through his chest into hers, and in that moment they both knew that everything had changed, that the manor itself seemed lighter somehow, as though the house too had been waiting for its master to finally come alive, and when they eventually emerged from the chambers hours later, dressed and attempting dignity despite their obvious contentment, They found the entire staff trying unsuccessfully to hide their knowing smiles, and Sebastian, rather than retreating into his old formality, simply pulled Eleanora closer and led her down to breakfast, where they sat not at opposite ends of the long table as they had for months, but side by side, their chairs drawn close, hands occasionally touching as they spoke of plans and future, and all the locked rooms, both literal and metaphorical, that they would finally open together. Spring arrived at Hartwick Manor like a benediction, the frozen earth giving way to green shoots and unfurling leaves, and with it came a transformation that went far beyond the seasonal change, for Sebastian and Eleanora had begun the work of turning the cold house into a home, a project that required not just physical renovation, but emotional archaeology, the careful excavation of years of accumulated sorrow and neglect. They started with the East Wing, those rooms that had been closed since the old Duke's death, rooms filled with heavy furniture and heavier memories, and together they threw open windows that had been shuttered for years, letting in light and air as they sorted through what should be kept and what should be released, and Eleanora noticed how Sebastian's hands would sometimes pause on an object, a book, a letter, a riding crop, and she learned to recognize when he needed her to ask about it, and when he needed her simply to be present in silence, holding space for grief that had never been properly mourned. The tenants noticed the change in their Duke before anyone else, for Sebastian began riding out to the farms and villages with Eleanora at his side, listening to concerns about drainage and crop rotation and disputed boundaries with a patience and genuine interest that his father had never shown. And more than once Eleanora watched him make decisions that favored fairness over profit, that chose the well-being of his people over the expansion of his coffers, and she understood that he was deliberately, consciously choosing to be a different kind of lord, a different kind of man. And when she told him how proud she was, he had pulled her into his arms right there in front of old Mr. Wickham and his sons, kissing her forehead with such tenderness that the farmer had smiled and said it did his heart good to see the manor filled with love again after so many years of darkness. Inside the house, small changes accumulated like interest, compound blessings that transformed the atmosphere entirely. Fresh flowers appeared in rooms that had known only dust. The pianoforte in the music room was tuned and played again, as Eleanora's fingers coaxed melody from keys gone silent. The library became a space they shared, rather than a refuge from each other, their chairs drawn close as they read aloud or simply sat in companionable silence, and the servants moved through halls that no longer felt like a mausoleum, but rather like a living, breathing home. And Mrs. Hartley remarked to the butler that she had never seen His Grace smile so much, had never heard him laugh the way he did now when the Duchess said something clever or teased him gently about his excessive seriousness. The garden became their special province, that space where they had first begun to truly see each other, and together they expanded it, adding new roses and a section of herbs that Eleanora planned to use for the still room she was establishing. And Sebastian would sometimes pause in his work to watch his wife kneeling in the dirt, her face smudged and her hair escaping its pins, and he would feel such overwhelming gratitude that she had been brave enough to write that letter, brave enough to force him out of his protective isolation, brave enough to love him, even when he had given her every reason to leave. And when she caught him staring, she would smile, that smile that was his alone. And he would cross to her and pull her to her feet and kiss her there among the roses, tasting earth and sunshine and the future they were building together, one small, deliberate choice at a time. The decision to open his mother's chambers came on a morning in late spring when Sebastian found himself standing before the locked door at the end of the north corridor, the brass key heavy in his hand, and Eleanora stood beside him in patient silence, her presence a steady anchor as he confronted what he had avoided for nearly a decade, those rooms that had been sealed the day after the Duchess's funeral and left untouched ever since, preserved like a shrine to grief that had never been properly laid to rest. The lock turned with difficulty, the mechanism stiff from disuse, and when the door finally swung open, the smell of lavender and old rosewater drifted out, his mother's scent, and Sebastian felt his throat constrict even as Eleanora's hand found his and squeezed gently, giving him permission to feel whatever came, and together they stepped into rooms frozen in time, dust motes, dancing in the sudden shaft of sunlight, as Sebastian pulled back the heavy curtains to reveal his mother's writing desk, still scattered with correspondence, her embroidery frame holding a half-finished piece, her jewelry box sitting open, as though she had just stepped away and might return at any moment. They spent hours there that day and many days following, sorting through a life with reverence and care, and Sebastian told Eleanora stories he had never shared with anyone, memories of his mother's kindness and her quiet strength, the way she had tried to shield him from his father's rages, the way she had taught him to find beauty in small things, even as she slowly faded under the weight of a loveless marriage. And Eleanora understood with painful clarity that Sebastian had locked these rooms, not out of anger, but out of love, so overwhelming he could not bear to face it, could not bear to see evidence of all he had lost, and she helped him now to sort what should be kept close and what could be gently released, packing away dresses for charity but preserving letters and small treasures. And when they found his mother's journal, Sebastian read passages aloud, his voice breaking as he discovered her prayers for his happiness, her hopes that he would one day find the love she had been denied. And Eleanora wept with him for the woman she had never known, but who had shaped the man she loved so deeply. The work of addressing the past extended beyond those chambers, for Sebastian had allowed relationships to wither during his years of self-imposed isolation, and now with Eleanora's encouragement, he began the difficult task of reconciliation, writing letters to his mother's sister, who had tried to maintain contact only to be rebuffed, inviting his younger cousins to visit the manor that had seemed so forbidding during his father's reign. And when his aunt arrived for a week-long stay, she embraced Sebastian with tears streaming down her face and told him he looked so much like his mother, had her same eyes, and she thanked Eleanora for bringing him back to them, for helping him find his way out of the darkness. And during that visit, Sebastian learned stories about his mother's youth, about her dreams and her laughter, and he began to understand her not just as the sad figure from his childhood, but as a whole person who had known joy before sorrow claimed her. And this knowledge brought a strange kind of peace, a sense that he was honoring her memory, not by remaining frozen in grief, but by choosing differently, by building the kind of marriage she had wished for him, by becoming the kind of man who could love openly and well. And as summer approached, and the manor filled with the sounds of visiting family and genuine warmth, Sebastian would sometimes catch Eleanora's eye across a room full of people, and see in her smile the recognition that they were doing it together. This work of healing, this brave venture into vulnerability, this transformation of inherited pain into chosen joy. And he knew that the letter she had written in desperation had saved them both. It had given them not just each other, but the possibility of a future unmarred by the shadows of the past. The anniversary of their wedding night arrived with autumn's return. The same season that had witnessed their lonely beginning now transformed into a celebration of all they had become. And Sebastian had planned the evening with meticulous care, a romantic recreation of that first night stripped of its coldness and infused instead with the warmth of genuine devotion. And when Eleanora entered their chambers, she found them lit with dozens of candles just as they had been a year ago. But now the light seemed golden rather than harsh, welcoming rather than exposing, and Sebastian stood waiting by the window where he had once delivered his cruel vow. But this time when he turned to face her, his expression held nothing but tenderness and a vulnerability that still sometimes took her breath away. This man who had learned to open his heart so completely after years of keeping it locked away. "A year ago tonight," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I stood in this room and made the worst mistake of my life. I told you I would never touch you, never claimed you as my wife, and I let fear and pride nearly destroy the greatest gift I had ever been given." And he crossed to her slowly, deliberately, his hands reaching for hers with the reverence of a man who understood exactly what he had almost lost, and Eleanora felt tears gathering as he continued. "I want to make a new vow tonight, my love. I promise to touch you every day with gentleness and passion, to claim you not as property but as partner, to build with you the kind of marriage that honors us both, and to be the husband you deserved from the beginning but were brave enough to wait for." And he drew her into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that had become familiar over these months, but never ceased to move her, and when they finally drew apart she was smiling through her tears, her heart so full she thought it might burst with the joy of it, with the knowledge that they had taken something broken and made it beautiful, something cold and transformed it into warmth. She had been planning to wait, to find the perfect moment to share her news, but looking at Sebastian's face in the candlelight, she knew there would be no moment more perfect than this. this anniversary of their beginning when they were consciously choosing their future together. And so she took his hands and placed them on her stomach, and watched as understanding dawned slowly in his eyes, watched as joy and terror and wonder chased across his features in rapid succession, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper. "A child. We are to have a child." And she nodded, her own eyes bright with unshed tears, and she watched as he sank slowly to his knees before her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his face pressed against her still flat stomach, and she heard him murmur promises to the life growing within her, promises to be present and loving and everything his own father had never been. And she stroked his hair gently as he wept, these tears so different from the ones he had shed in his mother's chambers, tears not of grief but of overwhelming hope, of second chances and new beginnings. And when he finally rose and pulled her close again, she felt the tremor in his hands, the way he held her as though she were infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. And he whispered against her hair, "I am terrified, Eleanora, terrified I will not know how to be a good father, that I will fail this child as my father failed me." And she drew back just enough to cup his face in her hands, to look into those eyes that had once been so cold but now held such depth of feeling. And she told him what she knew with absolute certainty. "You will be extraordinary, Sebastian, because you have already done the hardest work. You have learned to open your heart, to be vulnerable, to love without reservation. And those are the only skills that truly matter." And she felt him relax slightly in her embrace, felt him begin to believe in the possibility of this new role, this new identity as father. And as the candles burned low around them, they made their way to the bed they now shared every night, and Sebastian loved her with such exquisite tenderness, such reverent care, that she understood he was already practicing this new gentleness, already becoming the father he wanted to be. And afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, his hand resting protectively over the place where their child grew, Eleanora reflected on the strange and winding path that had brought them here, how her desperate letter had been the catalyst for transformation, how his pursuit through the storm had been the moment everything changed, how patience and courage and the willingness to be vulnerable had turned an impossible situation into love so deep and true it seemed to encompass not just the two of them, but the future, stretching out before them, full of possibility and promise, and the sweet uncertainty of a life built together, one choice, one moment, one brave act at a time. 5 years had passed since that storm-swept night, when Sebastian had pursued Eleanora's carriage through winter's fury, and the transformation of both the man and the manor was so complete that visitors who had known the estate during the old Duke's reign could scarcely believe they had returned to the same place, for where there had once been cold formality there now existed warmth and laughter, and on this particular afternoon in late spring the gardens bloomed with renewed vigor, roses and lilacs filling the air with sweetness, as two children played among the carefully tended beds that had once been his mother's pride and now flourished under Eleanora's devoted care. Sebastian stood at the library window watching his daughter Charlotte, now 4 years old, with her mother's dark curls and his own serious grey eyes, as she instructed her younger brother Thomas in the proper way to smell a rose without getting pricked by thorns, her small voice carrying the patient authority of one who took her responsibilities as elder sibling with utmost gravity, and Thomas, at 2 years old, regarded his sister with the adoration of one who believed she knew everything worth knowing in the world. And Sebastian felt his throat tighten with emotion, as it still sometimes did, when confronted with evidence of all he had nearly lost through his own cowardice and fear. Eleanora came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his with the easy intimacy of long partnership, and together they watched their children play in the same garden where they had once had their first real conversation, where she had tended his mother's roses in secret, and he had discovered her there, and felt the first crack forming in the armor he had built around his heart. And she leaned her head against his shoulder as she remarked softly that Charlotte had his mother's gentle way with growing things, that perhaps one day these gardens would pass to her care and continue blooming long after they were gone. And Sebastian kissed the top of Eleanora's head and murmured that his mother would have loved their children beyond measure, would have delighted in their laughter and their questions and their unbridled joy in simply being alive. The manor itself had been transformed room by room, the dark, heavy furnishings of his father's time replaced with lighter pieces, The windows that had remained shuttered for years, now thrown open to let in sunshine and fresh air, and the servants moved through their duties with smiles rather than the fearful efficiency that had characterized the household during Sebastian's youth. And even the tenants on the estate had noticed the change, for the Duke, who had once been remote and intimidating, now knew their names and their children's names, took interest in their concerns, made improvements to their cottages and fields, and they attributed this metamorphosis entirely to the Duchess, whose influence had gentled their lord and brought humanity back to the great house on the hill. As the afternoon wore on and the children were called in for their tea, Sebastian and Eleanora made their way to the library that had been the site of so many pivotal moments in their relationship, and Eleanora settled into her favorite chair near the fireplace while Sebastian browsed the shelves, and she watched him with the contentment of one who had found not just love but partnership, friendship, the kind of companionship that deepened rather than faded with time. And she thought about that desperate girl who had written a farewell letter in the depths of winter, never imagining that her act of courage would lead to this, to a life so full of warmth and meaning that some mornings she woke, still marveling at the transformation, and Sebastian turned from the shelves with a small leather-bound volume in his hands, the same book of philosophy they had discussed during their first midnight encounter in this very room, and he sat beside her and they read together in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined, while outside their children's laughter drifted through open windows and the roses bloomed in profusion. And this, Eleanora thought, this ordinary, extraordinary moment of domestic peace, and was the truest measure of how far they had travelled from that cold wedding night when he had vowed never to touch her, and she had believed herself condemned to a lifetime of loneliness. But love, she had learned, could transform even the most impossible situations if one had the courage to fight for it, the patience to nurture it, and the wisdom to recognize it even when it appeared in unexpected forms. Years later, on a quiet afternoon when the house had settled into that peculiar stillness that comes between the bustle of morning and the preparations for evening, Eleanora found herself alone in the library organizing correspondence when her hand fell upon a folded piece of paper tucked into an old journal, and even before she unfolded it, she knew what it was, recognized the weight of the parchment and the way the edges had softened with time. And there, in her own handwriting from 6 years past, was the farewell letter she had written in the depths of winter, the desperate confession of a woman who had believed she must choose between her dignity and her impossible love. And reading it now, she felt tears gathering not from sadness, but from wonder at how much had changed, how the girl who had penned these anguished words about leaving had instead found the courage to stay when Sebastian had pursued her through the storm, how the man who had vowed never to touch her had learned to hold her with such tenderness that even now, after years of marriage, his embrace could still make her heart quicken. And she thought about all the moments that had led them here, the small accumulations of trust and vulnerability that had transformed strangers bound by contract into partners bound by choice, and she understood with crystalline clarity that their story had never really been about the arrangement or the cold distance or even the dramatic pursuit, but rather about two damaged people learning slowly and painfully to open their hearts, to risk hurt for the possibility of joy, to believe that transformation was possible even when all evidence suggested otherwise. She heard Sebastian's footsteps in the hallway and looked up as he entered, and even now the sight of him could still take her breath away. This man who had seemed so unreachable and had become her dearest companion, and when he saw what she held, his expression softened with recognition, and he came to sit beside her, taking the letter gently from her hands and reading it again himself. And she watched emotions play across his features as he remembered that desperate morning when he had found these words and finally understood what he stood to lose. And he looked at her with eyes that still held traces of wonder that she had chosen to stay, to build this life with him. And he murmured that he kept her letter as well, carried it with him always, as a reminder of how close he had come to destroying his own happiness through fear and pride. And they sat together in the quiet library, surrounded by the books that had first brought them together, and Eleanora felt the weight of gratitude for every choice that had led them to this moment, every brave decision and frightening vulnerability, every step toward each other when retreat would have been easier. Dear listener, if this story has touched your heart, know that it carries within it a truth that extends far beyond the particulars of arranged marriages and ducal estates. For we all sometimes find ourselves trapped in situations that seem impossible, bound by circumstances or fear or the weight of past wounds, and we all must sometimes choose between the safety of distance and the risk of genuine connection. And the lesson here is simply this: that transformation is always possible, that love can bloom even in the coldest soil if we have the courage to tend it, that the barriers we erect to protect ourselves so often become the very walls of our prisons, and that the bravest thing we can ever do is to be vulnerable, to say "I love you" even when rejection seems certain, to stay when leaving would be easier, to fight for connection even when isolation feels safer. Perhaps you too are living in a kind of arrangement, whether of circumstances or habit or fear, waiting for permission to hope, to reach out, to risk your heart, and if so, let Eleanora and Sebastian's story remind you that change begins with a single choice, a single moment of courage, a single act of faith in possibility, and that the life you dream of may be closer than you imagine, if only you have the bravery to pursue it, to write your own farewell to fear and step instead toward love. May you find the courage to be vulnerable. May you recognize love even when it appears in unexpected forms. May you have the patience to nurture connection and the wisdom to fight for what matters. May you know that transformation is possible no matter how impossible your situation seems, and may you rest tonight in the peace that comes from knowing you are worthy of love, of tenderness, of the kind of deep connection that makes even the darkest moments bearable and transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. This story comes to you from Enchanted Chronicles, where we believe in the transformative power of love and the courage it takes to open your heart. If this tale has moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to hear that hope is never lost and second chances are always possible. And until we meet again in another story, another world, another journey of the heart, I wish you patience in your waiting, courage in your choosing, and love beyond measure in all your days to come.